What would you do if the only thing standing between you and the street was a rusted set of tools no one believed had any value? What if the one person who ever taught you anything was gone, and the only inheritance they left you was a skill the whole town said was dying out? Pull up a chair and settle in close. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, as we tell you the story of Tilda Marsh and the crumbling pottery works on the edge of Harrow Bend. Tilda Marsh was 22 years old the morning she arrived in the town of Harrow Bend, with a canvas sack over one shoulder and a wooden crate balanced in her arms. The crate held everything she owned that mattered: 3 changes of clothes, a tin of dried clay her teacher had called a starter, a battered notebook filled with measurements and firing temperatures written in a hand that was not her own, and a single potter's rib, a curved piece of whalebone, smooth and yellowed with age, that had belonged to the woman who had taught her everything she knew. The rib was the last thing Hester Quaid had pressed into her hands before the fever took her. Keep it moving, child. A still hand makes dead clay. Tilda had grown up in the town of Birch Falls, 30 miles north, in the house of an uncle who had made clear from the start that she was a burden he had inherited rather than chosen. She'd been 12 when her parents died of the same river sickness that swept through the lower valley that summer, and 12 when Harlow Quaid, no relation to Hester, had taken her in with the particular brand of charity that comes with an audience and disappears behind closed doors. She slept in the lean-to. She earned her keep in the kitchen. She asked for very little and received slightly less. The saving grace of her childhood had been Hester Quaid, an old woman who lived alone in a stone outbuilding behind the Baptist church, and who had, for reasons she never fully explained, decided that Tilda was worth teaching. Hester had been a potter for 50 years. She had thrown everything from funeral urns to water pitchers to the delicate medicine cups the apothecary used to dispense tinctures. She had a reputation in 3 counties and a waiting list she'd stopped keeping track of in her 60s. Tilda spent every free hour she could steal in that workshop, learning to wedge clay, to center it on the wheel, to coax the walls up thin and even. She learned to read a kiln's color like a language. She learned which clays were greasy and which were sandy, which would crack in the bisque fire and which would sing. Hester taught her without ceremony or sentimentality, correcting her hands with a firm directness, and praising her only when the work was genuinely good. It was the most honest relationship of Tilda's life. Hester died in February, on a morning so cold the window glass had frosted from the inside. She left no family, no will anyone could find, and no claim on the stone workshop that was formerly property of the church. The reverend was apologetic but clear. He had a congregation to think of. The building would be repurposed in the spring. Tilda's uncle did not hesitate. With Hester gone, and Tilda past the age where her labor was worth the cost of feeding her, the arrangement was concluded. He told her on a Tuesday. She was gone by Thursday, before the week could get any colder. She had $53. She had her canvas sack and her wooden crate. She had the address, written in the back of Hester's notebook, of a town Hester had mentioned only twice but always with a particular quality of attention: Harrow Bend. Good clay country down there, river-fed, mineral-rich. A woman could do something in a place like that if she had the patience for it. Tilda had the patience. She didn't have much else, but she had that. The town of Harrow Bend sat in a wide river bend between 2 low bluffs, the kind of place that looked, from a distance, like it had been there forever and intended to stay. The main street ran parallel to the river, and from it you could see the water year-round. In summer a slow brown thread, in spring a muscular surge of gray and green. There were merchants and a mill, a church with a green copper spire, a livery, a post office, and a hotel that also served meals. It was not a prosperous town, but it was a working one. The first person Tilda spoke to was Garrett Hollis, the livery owner, who took in the crate and the sack and the travel-worn young woman with a look of practiced assessment. He was a large, quiet man with a beard that had gone from brown to rust to silver in layers, like the rings of a slow-grown tree. "Looking for work or looking to settle?" he asked. "Looking to do both," Tilda said. "I'm a potter. I trained under Hester Quaid of Birch Falls." Something shifted in his face. Not skepticism, more like a careful reordering of assumptions. "Hester Quaid," he said. "I remember her. Bought a water set from her, maybe 15 years back. Never leaked a drop." "She didn't make things that leaked," Tilda said. A corner of his mouth moved. "No, she didn't." He set down the bridle he'd been working on. "You know there's a pottery works here in town. Been empty going on 3 years. Tilda felt something shift in her chest. "Where?" "End of Mill Road, past the second bridge. Old place belonged to a man named Deckard Soames. He died without heirs." buildings falling down. County's been sitting on the deed ever since, not sure what to do with it. No one's made a decent offer. What does the county want for it? Garrett Hollis looked at her steadily. More than you've got, probably. But you might ask Elmore Finch at the land office. He's a practical man. She thanked him. He offered her the use of the small room above the livery for 2 nights while she got her bearings. It was the first uncomplicated kindness anyone had offered her in months, and it nearly undid her. She did not let it. She had work to do. Elmore Finch was a practical man as advertised. He was also a man who had watched the Soames Pottery Works sit idle for 3 years accumulating tax debt, while the roof made its slow acquaintance with gravity. And he was not entirely immune to the persuasive effect of anyone offering actual money for a thing no one else had touched. The asking price was $80. Tilda had 53. She told him she had 35 and a plan. Elmore Finch looked at her over the tops of his spectacles for a long moment. Then he looked at the file on the Soames property, which was thick and unhappy. Then he looked at her again. What kind of plan? He asked. She laid Hester's notebook on his desk and opened it to the section on clay bodies. The careful notations about mineral content, firing ranges, the specific properties of river valley clay versus hill clay. She explained what she knew about the local geology from what Hester had told her. She explained what a working pottery meant for a town. Medicine cups, storage crocks, drain pipes, roof tiles, things a community needed, things they were currently buying from 50 miles away. Elmore Finch listened. He was not a man who had expected his Tuesday morning to go this way. But he was, as Garrett had said, practical. 35 now, he said finally. 45 more before winter. I'll hold the deed in trust until it's paid. It was nearly all she had. She laid the money on the counter. Her hands did not shake, though she noted distantly that they wanted to. She had the deed, or the promise of one. She had her tools. She had Hester's notebook. She walked back out into the Harrow Bend morning with the particular feeling of a person who has just leaped and has not yet seen where they'll land. The news of what she'd done moved through the town the way news does in small places. Ahead of her, arriving before she did. By the time she crossed the second bridge onto Mill Road, she was already a subject of discussion. The Pottery Works was a low stone building, longer than it was wide, set back from the road on a weedy lot that sloped gently toward a drainage ditch. At some point in its history, it had been a serious working enterprise. You could tell by the size of the kiln structure at the rear, a large beehive of fire brick, built to hold heat for days. But the roof of the main building had surrendered to a heavy snow 2 winters back and caved in on the east side, bringing a section of the wall down with it. The windows were all broken. The great wheel inside was buried under fallen timber and years of debris. The kiln, structurally, still stood, but the firebox was choked with rubble and the flue was blocked. Tilda stood in what had been the doorway. The frame was intact even if the door itself was long gone, and looked at it. It was catastrophically bad. She allowed herself 90 seconds to feel that, standing still with the smell of cold stone and wet ash around her. Then she went back to the livery, put on her oldest clothes, and started clearing. Garrett Hollis appeared on the second day, with a borrowed pry bar and no explanation. He worked alongside her for 4 hours without making conversation, which was exactly the right amount. The work was brutal. The collapsed roof timbers were heavier than anything she'd moved before, and the debris beneath them had compacted over 2 winters into something close to solid. She worked from the outside in, clearing the perimeter of the building first, then attacking the interior section by section. The flagstone floor, when she finally got down to it, was largely intact. Good, dense stone that had been laid by someone who knew what they were doing. The kiln was her priority. Without a working kiln, nothing else mattered. She spent 3 full days on it alone, clearing the firebox by hand, rebuilding the brick that had crumbled, repacking the mortar with a lime mixture she made herself from materials at the local mill. The work required a patience that most people would have found maddening. Tilda found it meditative. This was the kind of problem that had a solution if you simply refused to leave until you found it. On the 5th day, she lit a small test fire in the firebox and stood outside watching the flue for smoke. The smoke came out straight and clean. She permitted herself a single private moment of feeling, something that might have been joy. There were those in Harrow Bend who found the sight of her working offensive in a way they could not quite articulate. A young woman, alone, with no family name anyone recognized, taking on a derelict building and apparently intending to turn it into something. It disrupted a certain comfortable understanding of how things ought to go. The clearest expression of this disruption came from a man named Cassius Wend, who owned the dry goods and hardware, and who had, for the past 3 years, been the primary supplier of imported pottery ware in Harrow Bend. He stocked it at a considerable markup and had grown accustomed to that arrangement. He came to find her on the 7th day, riding a good roan horse, dressed in the particular way of a man who wants to remind you of the distance between you. He was perhaps 50, heavy in the shoulders, with a face that had been handsome once and had curdled slightly in the years since. "You're the girl who bought the Soames works," he said, though he said it in a way that put a question mark somewhere it didn't belong. Tilda set down the section of wall she was repointing and looked at him. "Tilda Marsh." "And you are?" He seemed faintly surprised to be asked. "Cassius Wend. I run the hardware and dry goods." "I know who you are," she said, which was true. Garrett had mentioned him. "I want you to understand the situation here," Wend said, his voice settling into the tone of a man explaining something to someone he doesn't expect to follow. "This town doesn't have the business to support a pottery works. Deckard Soames tried it for 20 years and barely kept his head above water. He died with debts he never cleared." He paused, letting that land. "I could take this property off your hands before you've wasted any more of your time. Give you $60 for the deed and your trouble." $60. He knew exactly what she'd paid, which meant the land office had talked, which meant he'd been to see Elmore Finch before he came to see her. "I'll think about it," she said, and turned back to the wall. She heard him shift on his horse. The offer was supposed to produce gratitude, or at least negotiation. Her indifference appeared to irritate him at a level below what he was prepared to manage. "You're a young woman alone," he said, his voice dropping into something that was meant to sound like concern, and didn't quite make it. "In a town that doesn't know you, there's easier paths than this." Tilda did not look up from the wall. She found the loose stone she was looking for, tested its fit, set it aside. "Thank you for the visit, Mr. Wynne," she said. He left. The sound of his horse on the road faded, and the wind came back in off the river, steady and smelling of mud and distance. Tilda pressed her palm flat against the cold stone of the wall she was rebuilding. Her breath was even. The anger was there, solid and useful. Like a coal she intended to keep burning until the kiln was lit and the work was done. The town thought she was a girl buying a ruined building. She was going to show them. She was a woman bringing one back to life. She was gathering her tools when an old voice spoke behind her. "He was in to see Elmore Finch before breakfast this morning." Tilda turned. Sitting on the low stone wall by the road was a woman she guessed was somewhere past 80, wearing a black coat and a wool hat, watching the proceedings with the calm of someone who has outlived most of the urgencies of the world. She introduced herself simply as May Sutton, and she said it in the way of a person who expects the name to mean something. "Did he try to buy it from Deckard's estate?" Tilda asked. "3 times, May Sutton said. "But Deckard died owing the county taxes, not Wend, and Elmore Finch is the kind of man who doesn't warm to being pushed." She tilted her head. "You trained under Hester Quaid, I hear." "I did." May Sutton was quiet for a moment. "Hester Quaid made the water set my mother used for 30 years. The clay was so even you could have used the pitchers for instruments." She looked at Tilda directly, with clear dark eyes. "Deckard Soames was a good potter," she said. "But he didn't understand the clay here. He brought in clay from the north because it was what he knew. Worked too hard for too little." She paused. "The river clay here is different. Runs through a limestone shelf 2 miles upstream, makes a body that fires a half-shade lighter and holds heat twice as long. Deckard never figured that out." Tilda looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because my husband figured it out," May Sutton said simply, 40 years ago, and wrote it down in a letter to Deckard that Deckard never answered. She reached into the pocket of her black coat and produced a folded piece of paper. It was old. The fold lines had gone soft, the paper the color of cream turning. She held it out. "I've been waiting for someone worth giving it to." Tilda took the letter. The handwriting inside was careful and precise, the hand of an engineer or a scientist, laying out observations about the limestone shelf, the mineral content of the clay, the specific temperature ranges that produced results unlike anything the standard northern clay could achieve. There were sketches of the river bend, annotations about seasonal variation in clay body composition. It was extraordinary. A document of observation and patience that had sat in a coat pocket for 40 years waiting. Tilda looked up. May Sutton's eyes held no sentimentality about it, just the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has placed something where it belongs. "Your husband's name?" "Rutherford Sutton," the old woman said. "He was a civil engineer who loved making things for no practical reason. He would have been very happy about this." She stood slowly, with the dignity of old bones that still work. The clay shelf is accessible from the north bank of the second bend, where the water runs shallow in dry months. You'll need to dig down about 18 inches. She adjusted her hat. Good luck, Miss Marsh. She walked away down Mill Road, and Tilda stood holding the letter in both hands, the wind coming off the river, the sound of Harrow Bend going about its business around her. The stone remembers what the river carries. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected any of it. But here, in this ruined building in a town that barely knew her name, she had been handed a letter from a dead man who had understood the ground beneath her feet 40 years before she arrived. She read the letter 3 more times. Then she folded it carefully, placed it inside Hester's notebook, and went back to work. The weeks that followed were the hardest and the most purposeful of her life. She established a rhythm. Mornings at the works, clearing and building. Afternoons at the river, learning the clay. Rutherford Sutton's letter proved accurate in every particular. The clay at the second bend was unlike anything she'd worked before. Dense and smooth, with a fine mineral quality that made it easy to center and extraordinary to throw. It dried with almost no cracking. In the test tiles she fired in the repaired kiln, it came out a warm, pale gold, close-grained and almost luminous. She started with small pieces, cups, bowls, small pitchers. Her hands relearned the rhythms of the wheel, finding the pace that Hester had drilled into her, slow to center, steady on the pull, patient on the collar. She talked to the clay the way Hester had taught her to, not in words but in attention. You don't force it, you persuade it. Garrett Hollis became a quiet patron. He brought her meals twice a week without announcing it, leaving them on the low wall by the road. She thanked him once, and he nodded once, and that was the whole of the conversation. He was a man who expressed himself through the doing of things, which was a language Tilda understood completely. The town watched. Some watched with curiosity, some with the particular patient amusement of people waiting for a prediction to come true. She'd be gone by autumn. She'd be gone by the first snow. The building was too far gone. The work was too hard. She was too young, too alone, too unknown. Cassius Wend did not visit again. But she heard from May Sutton, who made a habit of stopping by on her afternoon walks, that he'd been asking questions at the hardware about the cost of the roof repairs and the state of the kiln. He was calculating whether the venture was viable. If he decided it was, he'd come back with a different offer. The first piece she was proud of was a water jug, thrown from the limestone clay and fired to a warm, unglazed finish that showed the subtle patterning of the mineral content, small, intricate variations in color that looked almost like the surface of river-smoothed stone. She put it on the wall by the road one morning with a small card that said, Harrow Bend Clay, Marsh Pottery Works, 5 cents to look, 25 to own. By noon it was gone. She made 6 more. They were gone in 3 days. Elmore Finch came by the following week. He stood in the doorway of the works. The door was back on its hinges. By then, a solid pine replacement Garrett had helped her hang, and looked at what she'd done with the interior. The wheel was running. The kiln was producing. The shelves along the north wall held a growing inventory of fired ware, each piece irregular in the way of handmade things, each one marked with the quiet character of the clay she'd taken from the bend. You're making progress, Elmore said. He said it the way a practical man says something that has surprised him. I'm making pottery, Tilda said. The progress is a consequence. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, in the manner of a man revising an assessment. He left without saying anything further, which felt in the way of Harrow Bend like a form of approval. Autumn came hard and fast that year, the way it does in river valleys. A week of gold, and then a week of gray, and then cold that moved in off the water and didn't leave. Tilda was racing the season, trying to build enough inventory to sustain her through the slow winter months, trying to repair the last section of roof before the rain made it impossible. She was exhausted in a way that went all the way down to her feet, a tiredness that accumulated but never quite became defeat. Then, on an evening in early October, with the sky the color of pewter and the river running fast and dark, she heard the sounds from the road. It was a wagon, moving too fast for the condition of the track, and then a crash, the particular sound of a wheel going and a load shifting, and then a woman's voice, high and frightened, and a child crying. Tilda went out without stopping to think. The wagon had gone into the ditch, on the downhill side of the second bridge. One front wheel sheared clean off where it had caught a rut. The whole vehicle canted at a miserable angle. A man was trying to control a panicked horse, his hands bleeding from the reins. A woman was on the ground beside the wagon, holding a small girl who was screaming with a sound that was more fright than injury. An older boy, perhaps 10, stood frozen in the road with a cut above his eye that was bleeding freely. Tilda went to the boy first. "Come with me," she said, and her voice had the particular quality that comes from certainty, the certainty that there was a next step and she knew it. He came. She brought him to the works, sat him on the bench by the kiln where it was warm, pressed a clean rag to his forehead. "Hold this. Press hard. Don't let go." She went back out, the man. His name was Samuel Plover, she learned later. A farmer moving his family to a homestead further down the valley had gotten the horse calm. His wife, Dottie Plover, was still on the ground. The child in her arms, a girl of about 4, had gone from screaming to a glassy, shocky quiet that was more worrying than the crying had been. Dottie herself was shaking, her face gray. "Can you walk?" Tilda asked her. "My ankle," Dottie said. "I jumped clear when it went and I came down wrong." "Then don't walk on it, Mr. Plover." She looked at the man. "I need you to help her to the building. Can you do that?" He could. He did. She got them all inside. The fire was going. She boiled water and made strong tea, and wrapped the little girl in her spare coat and sat with Dottie Plover while Samuel went to find help from the town. The boy's cut, when she cleaned it properly, was shallow, messy, but not serious. The little girl was frightened and cold, not injured. Dottie Plover's ankle was worse. It was swelling fast, and she couldn't bear weight on it, and the look in her eyes was the particular look of a woman who has been holding herself together through the immediate emergency, and is now, in the warmth of a stranger's fire, starting to feel the edges of it. "You're all right," Tilda told her, and meant it as information rather than comfort. "The child is fine, the boy is fine, you're all going to be fine." Dottie looked at her with eyes that were wet. "I don't even know who you are." "Tilda Marsh. I run the pottery works." Dottie Plover made a sound that was almost a laugh. "You're the girl Wen says is throwing good money after bad." Tilda handed her the tea. "I'm the girl with the warm fire," she said. "Drink." Samuel Plover came back 2 hours later with Garrett Hollis and 2 men from the mill. They righted the wagon. They splinted the wheel enough to get it to the livery. They carried Dottie out on a board because her ankle was, as the apothecary confirmed the next day, cracked. Not broken clean, but cracked, and she was not to walk on it for 6 weeks. Before they went, Samuel Plover stood in the doorway of the works and looked at the wheel and the shelves and the pale gold pieces drying on the racks. "That's fine work," he said, with the honest brevity of a man who doesn't say things he doesn't mean. "Thank you," Tilda said. "I build in the off-season," he said. "Carpentry. I owe you something for tonight." He looked at the roof, the section above the east end that she still hadn't gotten to. "I'll be back next dry week." He came back. He brought a brother-in-law. Together, the 3 of them finished the roof in 2 days, working with a quick, competent efficiency that made Tilda feel, for the first time, that the building was actually going to last. When she tried to pay them, Samuel Plover shook his head. "We know what you did for my family," he said. "We don't forget." The story the Plovers told in town was the kind of story that moves differently than other stories. It was not dramatic, no blizzard, no miraculous cure, just a woman who had come out of a building in the dark and known exactly what to do. But that was its own kind of extraordinary in a place like Harrow Bend, where most people froze in the face of the unexpected. The narrative of the town changed. The widow's folly, that was what some had started calling the Soames works, with the same mean little pleasure people take in predicting failure, lost its audience. People began to stop on Mill Road and look at the building with different eyes. A few came inside to buy. More came to look and came back to buy later. Cassius Wend felt the shift, the way a man like that always does, in the numbers. The pottery ware he'd been selling at his markup was sitting on the shelf while people walked to the second bridge. He came back in November, earlier in the day this time, without the horse. He came on foot, which was its own kind of message. Tilda was at the wheel when he appeared in the doorway. "You've made something here," he said. He said it without the condescension of his first visit. Just a fact, stated by a man who deals in facts when they cost him something. She kept working. "Yes," she said. "I'd like to carry your work in the store," Wen said. "Commission arrangement. You get 70 cents on the dollar." It was a reasonable offer, more reasonable than she'd expected from him. She thought about it for 2 full rotations of the wheel. "Then, 80 cents, and you carry what I choose to send you. I won't make work for a shelf. I'll make what the clay wants, and you'll take what fits." He was quiet for a moment. Then, done. He left without the small victories he'd arrived looking for. She watched him go and felt nothing in particular. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Just the clean, simple completion of a thing. May Sutton was on the bench by the road when she looked up. "He'll be back," May said. "He'll be a reasonable partner now." Men like that are only impossible when they think they have the advantage. She looked at the works, the repaired roof, the new door, the shelves visible through the window. Rutherford would have liked this place, she said. He always said good clay is patient. It waits for the right hands. Winter came, and Tilda worked through it. The kiln kept the building warm enough to throw, and she threw every day. She made the practical things first. Crocks, pitchers, the wide low bowls the local housewives had been ordering since the first time they saw her work. She made the medicine cups the apothecary had been importing, and he switched to her stock within a month. She made drain tiles for the mill, and roof ridge pieces. For a farmstead, the plovers were helping build down the valley. The limestone clay held its character through every form, dense, pale gold, extraordinarily durable. In the long evenings, when the wheel was still and the kiln was cooling, she sat by the fire with Hester's notebook and Rutherford Sutton's letter and read through them both. They made a kind of conversation across time and distance, the old potter's knowledge and the engineer's meticulous observation, and she was the point where they met. She added her own notes in the margins. What she'd learned about this specific clay, this specific kiln, this specific quality of winter light through the north window. She was not just continuing a tradition. She was becoming part of it. The following spring, the road to the second bridge was worn to a proper track from the people who traveled it. She'd hired Samuel Plover's brother-in-law to help with the heavy work. She'd paid the last of what she owed Elmore Finch in February, and he had brought the deed to her himself, which was not something he typically did. "It's yours," he said, setting it on the wedging table with the care of a man who understands the weight of documents. Free and clear. She had looked at the paper for a long time. Then she had placed it in the tin box with Hester's notebook and Rutherford's letter, 3 documents from 3 different lives, all of them pointing at the same piece of ground. Dr. Prentice, the town's only physician, a quiet man in his 60s, who had said very little to her in all the months she'd been there, came to see her in April. He stood among the shelves and looked at the medicine cups with a professional attention. "These are the best I've seen outside of a city supplier," he said. "The clay body is unusually dense. No porosity. Limestone clay," Tilda said. "The river carries it down from a shelf 2 miles upstream." He nodded slowly, picking up one of the cups and turning it in his hands. "I have a problem," he said. "I need a specific vessel for compounding. A small crucible, essentially. Needs to hold heat evenly, no reactive minerals, must be sterilizable." He looked up at her. "No one in 3 counties makes something like that. I've been ordering from Philadelphia and they take 12 weeks. Tilda thought about it. "Bring me your specifications," she said. He did. She worked on it for 3 weeks, testing different forms, different thicknesses, different firing temperatures. She consulted Hester's notes on high-fire clay bodies. She ran 4 firing cycles before she had a form she was satisfied with. When she brought the first 6 to Dr. Prentice, he held them to the light, ran his thumbnail around the rim, then filled one with water and held it over the candle on his desk. After 2 minutes, he set it down. "How many can you make?" he said. Word of the physician's order spread through the medical community the way that kind of news does, quietly and with authority. By summer, she had standing orders from 2 other doctors in neighboring counties, a request from the nursing college 30 miles away, and a letter from a pharmaceutical concern in Cincinnati asking about bulk supply. The town that had expected her to fail was now, in its gradual and unannounced way, depending on her. The women who had murmured about the foolishness of the Soames purchase came to the works and ran their fingers along the edges of the bowls and asked about glazing and talked about their kitchens. The men who had given her the particular silence of people waiting for a woman to admit defeat now nodded at her on Mill Road with the nod of one working person acknowledging another. Cassius Wen's commission arrangement held. He proved, as May Sutton had predicted, a reasonable partner once the power was even. He mentioned once that the markup on the imported ware had been substantial. He did not apologize for it, but he mentioned it, which was the closest thing to acknowledgement his character could produce. Harrow Bend had not been looking for a pottery works. It hadn't known it needed one. But Tilda Marsh had looked at the ground here, literally and otherwise, and read it more carefully than any of them had bothered to, and what she had found in the clay, in an old man's letter, in the discipline Hester Quaid had pressed into her hands, was not just a trade. It was a conversation between the land and the people on it, interrupted for 30 years, and now resumed. One evening in late summer, she sat on the bench outside the works with the whalebone rib in her hand, turning it as she always did when she was thinking. The light on the river was the long, golden light of a summer evening, going slowly toward dark, and the sound of Harrow Bend carrying on was a comfortable sound at that distance. Garrett Hollis came by on his way home from the livery and stopped. "You thought about taking on a student?" he asked. Tilda looked up. She hadn't, not in so many words, but the question settled somewhere familiar. "Not yet," she said. "I'm still learning the clay." He nodded and walked on. She looked down at the whalebone rib. "Keep it moving, child. A still hand makes dead clay." She had arrived in Harrow Bend with $53 and a wooden crate and a skill that a whole town had predicted would fail. She had listened when no one was talking, learned what the ground was trying to say, and built something that would outlast the predictions and the scorn, and probably most of the people who'd offered both. If Tilda Marsh's story teaches us anything, we think it's this. The thing everyone else has given up on is often the thing most worth looking at. Value has a way of hiding in plain sight, patient as clay, waiting for the hands that know how to find it. What was it that the town missed about that old building? What do you think Tilda found that no one else was willing to look for? Let us know in the comments below, and if this story moved you, please share it with someone who might need it tonight. We'll be right here at the fireside, whenever you're ready to come back.